This is the Financially Simple Podcast, a show dedicated to destroying the complexities of money for today's small business owner. And now, here's your host, pizza-loving, certified financial planner, Justin Goodbread.
Welcome to Financially Simple. This is a finance show for small business owners about money, how it works in our business and our personal lives, and how we can build wealth to be financially independent. I'm your host, Justin Goodbread. Today is episode number 35. Today's episode is titled, Preparing for the Unexpected, the Disruption Just Before the Close. So we've reached the point in our podcast series on preparing a business to sell where we're just about ready to walk over and sell the business. The closing is scheduled. And perhaps just beforehand, a disruption occurs. Have you ever experienced a last-minute disruption before? We all have. I know I have many times. And last-minute changes can be either good or bad. You know, perhaps one of the saddest last-minute changes, which I read about some years ago, transpired around the sinking of the Titanic. Obviously, the Titanic was a massive ship. It was the unsinkable ship. And despite the fact that many in the United States today believe it was a fictional film only starring Leonardo DiCaprio, the ship actually was real. I read that too. I almost fell off my chair when I realized that most of the Americans believe it was a story. But no, it was real nonetheless. And in the North Atlantic, the ship hit an iceberg. Well, one last-minute decision could have prevented this. You see, right before the ship left harbor, there was a officer change. The second officer, David Blair, was removed from the crew just before the ship left. And he totally forgot to hand the key to a locker that contained binoculars for the lookout. The ship had set off before he realized, and the crew had to watch for icebergs using only their eyes. Obviously, that last-minute change was catastrophic. On the opposite hand, perhaps a last-minute change can be good. One of my heroes in American history is Martin Luther King Jr. I love the man. I love his work. I love everything he stood for. I've yet to read anything that I disagree with from Martin Luther King Jr. And the minute I say these four words, we're all going to recognize this particular string of words and how it impacted our United States, the American history. Martin Luther King Jr. expressed in one of his speeches, I have a dream. And his I Have a Dream speech, as it's now called, became such a powerful and inspiring speech that it forever changed the landscape of the Americas. On August of the 27th of 1963, in front of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King was ready and prepared to deliver a speech. But it wasn't until Mahalia Jackson, a gospel singer in the audience, shouted, "Tell them about the dream," that Dr. King began to improvise. And he began to speak from his heart, not his prepared notes. And the result was perhaps the greatest example of public speaking in American history, and it went on to change hundreds of thousands of lives for the better. So last-minute changes, as we've seen with the Titanic, can be bad. Many times they can be good. In my life, I personally have experienced many changes which affected the outcome of my life in some positive or negative manner. And I'm sure if you sit down and think about it, you too can testify of the occurrence. With this as a backdrop, let's talk about your business as it's approaching the close. Changes could happen. Last-minute changes could be positive or negative. So here's a list of some last-minute changes that I have personally witnessed, that I've personally seen, that I may have myself experienced or I've been with clients and they've experienced it. Just like in real estate, if you've ever sold a house, you may have heard this. Financing can often be the first disruption. Too many times I've heard the buyer say, I have the money approved. And then at the last minute, some underwriter gets blamed, and he or she's in a back room of a bank or a lending institution, and they refuse to sign off on the deal because something didn't meet the sniff test. I was on the buyer side of a big purchase, and we actually had written approval from the bank. We had a deal put together. We had an offer letter. We had approvals. Everything was ready to go. And then we had one small contingency throw us a curveball right at the last minute, and actually the deal fell apart. You know, it's been said by Bob Hope. He put this out there. I just love this statement. He said, a bank is a place that will lend you money if you can only prove you don't need it. That was Bob Hope. Mark Twain put it this way. He said, a banker is a fellow who'll lend you his umbrella when it's shining outside, but wants it back the minute it begins to rain. Those two guys certainly put a hurting on some bankers. That's not to say the bankers are evil, no, by no means. But many times financing or bankers or the deal, the people who hold the purse strings, at the very last minute they could get uneasy or they could find something that just no one else saw and it could create last minute changes. Another last minute change which I have personally seen is disgruntled parties. This is perhaps the second most common reason that I can come up with. And most common, disgruntled people typically occur between partners or shareholders. And they're often on different pages. And they end up on different pages at the end of the process. We had one particular client. I was actually on the buyer side, and the seller side, he had two partners, and one partner was doing all the talking. We never really saw the other partner. And about 60 days before we were set ready to sell, the partner who was kind of aloof, they were always never available, they kiboshed the whole thing. It didn't move any forward. It just stopped dead in its tracks. So this is why I fall back onto the assessment. If you're on the seller side and you have partners or if you have shareholders, your job, if you're listening to this, is to bring all of the parties to the same point of sale at the exact same time. You don't want to have somebody who's running their own agenda, running their own different scenario. Another problem which I've seen is you could be waiting on approvals from third parties. Perhaps you're waiting for a lessor to validate a new buyer, or maybe a supplier or contract transfer holds up the deal. Many times it's things outside of your immediate control, but it may be ancillary parties that you're waiting on. So I've seen that hold up transactions. The worst of all could be it's just a dead deal. Yes, I've seen where some buyers get right up to the purchase table and then get cold feet and walk away. I've seen that on the seller side too. I actually saw one seller who we walked all the way through the process and then the buyer just made him mad. He's like, no, I'm not selling it to him. We'll find somebody else. And he just walked away. Now, many times the seller is locked into the deal. Many times they are due to the legal documents, but the buyer many times are able to walk away for one reason or the other. I was on another deal with a buyer the day before closing. The day before closing, the buyer had a 180-degree change of heart. And all of us are scratching our heads. I was on the seller's team and no one had a clue what happened. We just get a phone call and it says, he's not buying. The deal's done. We'll see you later. Man, everybody was angry. The seller went through the roof. I think it was another liftoff out of NASA. I mean, Cape Canaveral down there in Florida had another rocket go through the air when that man heard that news. Now, needless to say, long story short, everyone a few weeks later found out that the buyer had terminal issues that came about and he wasn't going to purchase it due to health issues. And at that point, it did help us understand a little bit, but it sure didn't make the circumstances anymore to deal with.
You are listening to Financially Simple, destroying the complexities of money for today's small business owner.
So what are we to do when we find ourselves in the position of unexpected events? The most common thing which happens, we'll start to reduce the purchase price. Perhaps the easiest illustration I can give is in the real estate markets. Imagine you have a contract to sell your house, and the home inspector finds a problem with your house. But you really want to sell it. You've already got an offer on another house, and you don't want to move into a rental house, so what are you going to do? Well, one of the first things you do is you say, well, I can either fix this problem myself, or I can reduce the price so the buyer can fix the problem. I actually had this happen on a house that we sold before we moved to our farm. We had a nice little house, but there was a shower leaking that we had no clue about. And the home inspector found just a little bit of water stain underneath the master shower from underneath the garage area. And I had no clue, never saw it. And we came down to it. It was like $4,000 or $5,000 to replace the shower to get it repaired. And we had to close. And so did the buyer. We had to close. So what we did was we reduced our home sales price by half of the amount of money it would take to repair that damage. And the seller as well kicked in about half of the cost. And so that way the buyer could pick out their own tile of the house. So in business, if you find some things, one of the most common things that happens is to reduce the purchase price. Another common practice is to place a guarantee on the sale. So again, if I'm using the house sale as akin to a business sale, one of the things we also did when we sold our house is we put a home warranty in place. Now, in business, you really can't buy a business warranty that comes in and fixes everything. But one of the things you can do is add a guarantee, a seller's guarantee. And the most common reason I've seen people come in and have to offer seller guarantees is whenever the business that they're selling has some delayed income, or maybe they had a big contract that just hasn't paid yet, or maybe the target revenues are slightly off. And many times the seller will have to reduce the price or add a seller guarantee so that if the sales don't hit the target that everybody was expecting, then there would be an adjustment later on. Another thing that you can do in the event of a disruption actually came from one of my mergers and acquisition friends, and he loves to do this. He says he puts a holdback or an earnout in place. So we talked about this in episode 30 a little bit, but let's just do a quick refresh. A holdback is where you take a portion of the purchase price and you retain it in escrow. And if the buyer doesn't receive what was anticipated, then the money reverts back to the buyer, thus reducing the purchase price. Now, if the buyer does receive what is anticipated, then the money is released and it goes to the seller. Well, very similar to that, not exactly the same, is an earnout. And an earnout is a place where the buyer comes in and they say, you know what, I really don't think the company's worth this number, let's say $1 million, but the seller does. So they may, at the very last minute, say, look, we'll put an earnout in place. And if the company does better than expected, then the seller could actually end up with a greater sales price. So there's two possibilities that my mergers and acquisition friends tell me that they love to do. I personally have never been a part of either of those at this particular phase, but I challenge you, if you want to learn more about the earnouts or the buyouts, go back to episode number 30 and listen to those. The biggest key here that we must remember is just because you run into unexpected roadblocks, it doesn't mean the deal is dead. It doesn't mean that the business is over and you've got to go back and start from scratch. No, oftentimes there are ways to still get the deal done and you can sell the business. But my point in this episode today is this: planning wins every time. If we can plan well in advance, almost like a chess game, and you're looking 3 or 4 or 5 or sometimes 10 moves ahead. Well, if they move the knight, you're going to move the bishops. If they move the bishop, you're going to move the pawn. If you can plan your exit well in advance, then you can virtually eliminate most disruptions. There is no reason in today's society with today's technology that we should enter this phase of the game with surprises. But sometimes they happen. Sometimes they're because of things outside of control. Sometimes it could be that the buyer does end up finding a terminal health issue and they just can't buy the business. But friends, we're getting close. Next episode, we're going to deal specifically with the closing and what you can expect. Until then, guys, like I always say, life is hard, life is complicated. Money, it doesn't have to be. Let's continue to make our lives, at least financially, simple. Hey, y'all go out and make it an outstanding day today.
You have been listening to the Financially Simple podcast. The information in this show is for informational purposes only. This show is not investment advice. Instead, seek help from a competent financial advisor. Justin Goodbread, CFP, is an investment advisor representative of Heritage Investors, a registered investment advisor.